Hi, I'm Jacqueline, and in this video we're going to be talking about painting fabric with acrylic paints. And I have to tell you, I had so much fun working on these projects. My imagination just kind of started to go crazy as I was doing these, because really you can use fabric painting in place of applique or embroidery in just about any project. So if you're getting a little bit tired of applique or embroidery, or you're looking for a quicker way to embellish your projects, this is a great way to do it. So a couple of the projects that I made, this was a tote bag that I painted, and this design came from the Folk Garden collection of embroidery patterns, and I just painted it instead of embroidered it. And this is a little block that I painted, and I just love how this came out. And I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with this one yet. I think I might put it into a table runner or like a table mat or something like that. So anything that you do that you would normally use embroidery or applique for, you can paint. And then I'm also going to show you some ways to embellish your painted fabric once you're done. So that can even add another little extra special touch to your projects. And if you're not a painter, if you've never painted, or if you've painted before and just not liked your results, just don't be intimidated by this. It's pretty easy, and actually the supplies are really inexpensive, so you can get some paint and some textile medium and some really inexpensive muslin fabric and just practice a lot until you're really happy with the results, and I think you're going to have a lot of fun with it. So let's get started. These are the supplies you will need to do fabric painting with acrylic paints. You will need fabric to paint on. I usually just use 100% cotton, like quilting cottons. You will need a styrofoam or plastic disposable plate, some acrylic paints, which come in a large variety of colors and brands. You will need textile medium. This is also sometimes called fabric medium, and again, comes in a lot of different brands. You will need an assortment of paintbrushes. I like to use flat brushes and round brushes in different sizes, and I recommend just getting inexpensive brushes. The acrylic paints can be difficult to wash from your brushes, and you don't want to ruin expensive brushes doing this. You will need your pattern to trace onto your fabric. You will need some permanent markers. You will need fine permanent markers, but you also may want some medium point permanent markers as well. You will need freezer paper, which you can find at your grocery store. And then some miscellaneous supplies are a light box for tracing, an iron, a water container with water in it for rinsing your brushes, and lots of paper towels, and probably an apron will be useful as well. So this is my original pattern, and this is the fabric that I traced the pattern onto using a light box, and I've used a fine point permanent marker. You want to get as fine a point as you can get. That'll just help you to get a sharper, more detailed pattern on your fabric, and you also want to make sure that it's permanent. Now it's up to you as far as how detailed you want to get with tracing on your pattern design. So for example, this pattern has a lot of little vein lines in the leaves. And here you can see some of the leaves I haven't even bothered to trace those on, and some of them I did. That's just up to you as far as how detailed you want to get with your design. If you're brand new to fabric painting or painting in general, you probably just want to keep it as simple as possible. The other thing I did not do is I didn't trace these little dots that are in the middle of the berries, because this is just going to get covered over with paint anyway, and those are easy enough to just add in later as details. So the next thing I'm going to do, now that I've got my pattern traced onto the fabric, I've got a piece of freezer paper, which is just a little larger than the design. And I'm going to flip this over, and I'm just going to iron. This is the waxy side of the paper facing down, and I'm going to iron that onto the back of the traced pattern. And that's another reason that you want to use a permanent marker, not like a friction marker or something like that, that is going to disappear when you heat it up. And so it has to be permanent. And using a permanent marker is also a good idea. That way you know that it's not going to run when you add your paint to the front. Now if you want, you can go back and just give it a quick shot with the iron on the front too, as well as the back, to make sure that your freezer paper is secure. Here is a different design that I've traced onto an inexpensive canvas tote bag, which I got at my local craft store. And this was the original design. And you can see I wanted it to be quite a bit bigger for this tote bag, so I increased it by 150% on my copier. And then it didn't all fit onto one sheet, so I just taped the two pieces together. And again, I traced using my fine point permanent marker. And what I did was I just took this pattern and inserted it into the bag so that I could trace it onto my tote bag. And you'll find that if your bag is pretty thin, if the fabric's pretty thin, you shouldn't have any trouble seeing the design through the light box to do your tracing. So another tip about tracing your design, remember we said you don't have to put all of those little tiny details, like here for the leaves, I did not put the veins in the leaves. This one I just put the vein in the leaf because I was tracing and I just forgot and just went ahead and did it. But like these little dots in the middle of the flowers, you probably don't have to add either. And another tip for doing the dots, now if this was an embroidery pattern, these dots would probably refer to a French knot. And you don't have to draw the full size dot onto your fabric. What you can do is just put a little tiny dot there for placement, and then I'm going to show you a really quick and fun and easy way to make perfect dots when you're doing fabric painting. And now that I've got my design traced onto the bag, I once again want to get a piece of freezer paper that's a little bit larger than the design, and I'm going to take that and put that wax side up and just put it inside the bag behind the design, and I'll iron it in place the way I did for this other piece of fabric that we did. And there are a couple of reasons why you want to put freezer paper behind your design when you're doing fabric painting. One is it stabilizes the fabric so that when you're painting, you're not pulling and stretching the fabric. It just makes it a lot easier to work with. The other reason is that will keep the paint from seeping through to the back side. So say I was doing something like this and I was painting and the fabric was seeping through to the back, what could happen is it could smudge. If I moved the fabric, it could then smudge and come through on other parts of my design, and I don't want that to happen. And then also if I'm doing something like a tote bag where I've got another piece of fabric on the back, I don't want the paint to seep through this front panel and then make splotches on the back of my bag. So that is why we use freezer paper. So here are some sample fabrics to show you what your paint might look like on different kinds of fabric. The paint has been mixed in a 1-to-1 ratio with the textile medium. And the top row, which is a little more transparent, is just one layer of paint. And then the bottom row is 2 layers of paint where I let the first layer dry and then I add another layer. And this one is a white on white, and you can see in that top layer a little bit of the pattern coming through. And then this is another white on white fabric, and you can see with this one even more of that pattern is coming through, which can be a nice effect. So you can just kind of experiment and play with these and see what kind of a look you want. You can test your fabrics like this too. All I've done is taken some scraps of fabric and fused some pieces of freezer paper to the back to stabilize them, and just played with my paints to see what kind of look I would get on those fabrics. Now we're going to actually start the fun part, which is the painting. And this is just a scrap piece of fabric that I'm using for practice. And I fused a piece of freezer paper to the back. And I'm going to just get my acrylic paint. And it comes in a lot of different brands, and it comes in a whole lot of different colors, and it's really inexpensive. Usually these are less than $2 at the craft store, and a lot of times you can get them on sale much less than that. So you can collect a lot of colors and really have fun playing with your colors. So I'm going to just add a couple of drops of each color to my styrofoam plate or a plastic plate, whatever you've got. And then I'm going to add a couple of drops of my textile medium. And you can see this paint is really thick. Some of them are thicker than others. And the reason that we use textile medium is, one, it makes your fabric softer. If you were to just paint straight acrylic paint onto your fabric, it would end up really stiff. And generally for a fabric project, that's not what you want. The textile medium also thins out the paint and makes it easier to work with. So like this green that was really, really thick and kind of hard to get out of the bottle, it's going to thin that out and make it easier to work with. And I'm using about a 1-to-1 ratio. You don't have to be really exact about that. The more textile medium you add, the thinner the paint will be and the more transparent it will be. So this is something that you can play with and just decide what you want to do. So I'm just going to actually use my brush to mix my paints with my textile medium. The other thing that thinning out with the textile medium does is it helps the paint to kind of absorb into the fabric so it will be more permanent. So you can just start kind of practicing and seeing how the paint behaves on your fabric depending on how much textile medium you have in there. And what I recommend doing is having some paper towels, and I always blot my brushes and get them as clean as I possibly can. What you don't want is a lot of water in your brush, like when you're cleaning your brushes in between colors. So a lot of times if I'm using similar colors or similar valued colors, like even if I want to go from the pink to the green, if I get my brush really clean on this paper towel, I can just go in here. I'm going to mix in my green. And I can wipe the excess off on the paper plate. And I can play with my fabric and just see how that green looks on my fabric. So the other thing about textile medium is it makes your paint easy to work with so you can blend colors. So for example, if I wanted to do some shading on a leaf, I can do some of this light green, and I'm just going to use the edge of my flat brush. I like to use a flat brush for larger shapes. And that way I can just use the flat edge of the brush to kind of follow along the contour of the shape. And I can kind of fill that in. And then I'm going to wipe the excess off on my paper towel. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to grab some of this darker green, and I can go in and I can just kind of add that. And because the paint has that textile medium in it and it's thinner and it stays wet for longer, it gives me more time to shade if I want to. So another thing you can do with your textile medium, you can put it directly on the fabric. So I don't recommend squirting it on because you won't have any control, but if you just put some of that textile medium right on your plate and dip into your plate, dip into your textile medium, you can fill in your shape with the textile medium, and that will make your paint, what's called open time, which is how long your paint will stay wet and workable for. So it increases your open time of your paint. And now I can go in and grab some of the green. And obviously I didn't clean my brush really good because I've got some green there, but that's okay because we're working with green. So I can fill that in, and I can grab some of this dark green, and I can do more shading. And you'll get more of a watercolor effect with this, and you'll see how it's kind of bleeding outside the line. So that'll give you a watercolor effect. If you don't like that bleeding, then what you want to do is either make sure that you're mixing your textile medium right into your paint, or don't go all the way to the edge. So if I want to add the textile medium without it bleeding, what I can do is just do the middle of the shape. Don't take the textile medium all the way out to the line, and then I can add my paint. And it will still increase that open time a little bit. It's not as wet. And sometimes you can see I don't even rinse my brush. If I'm mixing colors, it doesn't really matter. And you can see how you can get a really pretty blended watercolor look. And I can just keep adding that dark green if I want. And I can blend it as much as I want. I could leave it like that. I can blend it a little bit more. Now let's say I want to paint some veins on this leaf. What I want to do is I want that paint to dry completely. So I can either just let it air dry for several hours, or what I would actually do is hit it with a hairdryer and let the heat dry that paint up for me so that I can add another layer. Another thing I forgot to mention for this step is you do want to be wearing an apron because acrylic paints do tend to be permanent on fabric and you don't want to mess up your clothes. So always wear an apron when you're doing this. So for this I was using a flat brush, like I said was my favorite, and I think I'm done with this brush now. So I've wiped most of the excess paint onto my paper towel. Now I'm going to go use my water, get it really good and clean, and dry it really well. Again, you don't want to use a wet brush. You don't want to be diluting your paint or your textile medium with a lot of water when you're doing this. So if you do clean with water, get it really dry in between. So now I've got this little round brush, and I think I want to maybe practice doing some vines. So I think I'll dip this. If you're doing thin lines, the thinner your paint, the easier it is to work with. You'll get a smoother line. So I think I'm going to just get my brush good and wet with the textile medium. And then I'm going to go into the green. And then I'm just going to practice doing some vines and stems. And obviously the smaller your brush, the thinner of a line you'll get. And the more practice you get with this, the better you'll get at it. That's why it's always good to do a practice, because you can see already my lines are getting better as I'm getting used to the feel of this brush on this fabric. And then finally, I had mentioned a way to make really cute, perfect dots. So what you can do is, you want fresh paint for this. Make sure that your paint isn't starting to dry out and get gunky on your plate. So when you've got fresh paint, you take your brush, but you're going to use the handle end and dip it in the paint, and you can just do this. And I hope you can see that. Let me do it with a darker green so you can see a little bit better. Probably need a little bit more paint on there, but the bigger the brush handle, the bigger the dot will be. So make a little more paint. And this handle's slightly bigger. So there you can see. And if you find that it's running a lot on the edges, then I would just recommend doing this step with straight paint, maybe not using the textile medium in it, because the textile medium can make it tend to run a little bit. So that's the basics of doing your painting. Practice on different kinds of fabric, practice with different colors, and vary the amounts of textile medium and different sizes of brushes, and see what you like best. So here's some painting that I've done on my piece of plain fabric with the freezer paper attached to the back. And here is the painting that I did on my pre-made canvas bag. And so the painting was really fun, but the doodling with the pens is really fun too. There's a lot of different details you can add. So you can either use your fine point marker again, and you can also use something a little bolder like a Sharpie medium point. And again, it's great to get one of these pieces of scrap paper that you've made with your freezer paper on the back, and you can kind of test your markers and just see how fat the lines are on your fabric and see how you like them before you do them on your project. So what I want to do is I'm going to leave the freezer paper on the back because it's going to continue to give me that stability as I draw on the fabric. If you forget and pull the freezer paper off the back, you just re-iron it onto the back. You can reuse the same piece of freezer paper a few times, or you can just get a fresh piece, iron it on the back, and then you're ready to go. So here I'm going to use my fine marker first, and I can outline. And the great thing about this is if your painting isn't great, like if your painting didn't stay in the lines, you can just add this to sharpen up your edges. So here I'm just kind of doing an outline. You could also add some extra details, like you could add some doodly, maybe some extra vines here, just for a little extra interest. You could add the veins to your leaves. So there's a lot of things you can do. Have a lot of fun with that. And here is an example of some doodling that I did on this. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see it a little bit better. So here you can see I've added some extra details which weren't a part of the original pattern. And here I've added some extra details. Here, this was kind of a detailed pattern in this feather, and my painting wasn't really great, so I outlined those little chevron stripes to just kind of delineate the edges of the pattern and make it look sharper and cleaner. And then to add the words in the middle, for that I actually used the medium point Sharpie marker. So you can see how this can get, you can really add a lot of fun and creativity just by doodling and adding all kinds of extra details. So once you've finished doing all of the details, you can then remove your freezer paper. And like I said, if you forget, like if you take the freezer paper off and then you think, oh, there was a section I missed or I want to add a little bit more, you can just go ahead and iron that freezer paper back on. But once you're all done, what you want to do is wait 24 hours and then heat set it with a hot iron. You're just going to take the hot iron and go over the top of your painting and then let that set again for at least a few more days. So here's an example that I showed you where I've added a lot of extra detail with my marker just by doing some doodling around the edges. And here's an example of the tote bag that I did. And for this, I just did some light outlining with a fine point marker. I didn't do a lot of extra detail. I added a little detail to that flower in the middle, but mostly I just kept the design the way it was and did a little bit of outlining to define the pattern. And then finally, something that's really, really fun, and I really had a great time doing this. You can add embroidery to your painted block. So you can see here, this was the block that I painted, and I drew in, if you remember, I drew in some details with a marker. And then what I did was I used just two strands of embroidery floss, and I decided to embroider those little extra vine details. And here you can see this is where I drew the lines in with my permanent marker to make the veins on the leaves. And here I've actually embroidered those lines, those vein lines on the leaves. And I'm going to zoom in so you can see the detail a little bit. And I outlined the flower again with 2 strands of floss, and I added just a little French knot in the center just for something a little extra. And I really, really like the way this is coming out. I'm going to finish the embroidery on those vein leaves here that aren't finished yet. And then I'm going to put this into a quilt block. So now that your blocks are finished, you've got them painted and you've added your details with your marker, or you've embroidered them and you've heat set them. Remember, you're going to use a hot iron to heat set the paint about 24 hours after you've finished painting. Then to wash them, you're just going to wash them in warm water on a gentle cycle. And I actually waited a few weeks just to be extra sure that my paint wouldn't wash out. So after I set it, then I waited a couple of weeks to wash it, and it worked out just fine. The paint stayed great. The marker faded just a tiny bit, and if you wanted to, you could just always go back in with the marker and just darken those lines up again if you wanted to. So now this block is ready to be added to any project that I would use using an applique or an embroidered motif in my block. So that was the tutorial about painting on fabric with acrylic paints. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're going to give this a try. And don't forget to send me your photos because I love seeing your projects. You can email them to me or post them on my Facebook page or in my Facebook group. Thanks. Have a great day.